ancestry himself, just like Captain Henry Wirz and his family. And in the Middle Ages, the name Winkler meant someone who lived on a corner or who owned a shop. Dr. Winkler states that the best decision he made in his entire life was to get married and to have children. And of course, he has a wife and 2 sons and 3 grandchildren. One of his sons is with us today, and I failed to introduce him. Kyle, right here on the front row. Will you raise your hand? We appreciate you being here today as well. Dr. Winkler has an extensive teaching career. He's taught classes at Brigham Young University from 1981 to 2018, and also taught classes at Utah Valley University from 1999 to the present. During his teaching career, he has taught over 200 different classes. Dr. Winkler is also a veteran, having served in the Naval Reserves. I asked him, how did you serve in the Naval Reserves in Utah? They had to get on a plane, Charles, and fly to San Francisco to find some water. But anyway, that's how they did it. So Utah's got a Navy. I didn't know that. All right. Much to his great disappointment, Dr. Winkler has not been able to find any Confederate ancestors, or Union for that matter, who fought in the Civil War, because they were, as he was saying, chasing Indians in Utah at the time. Dr. Winkler has 3 master's degree and a PhD in history from Utah State University, the Catholic University of America, and Brigham Young University. Dr. Winkler is the history librarian at BYU, and I believe the senior librarian there as well. Is that correct? And he also teaches university courses at BYU and Utah Valley University. In 2010, over 600 students in the social sciences area of UVU voted him Teacher of the Year. Before he finished his doctorate and began employment at universities, Dr. Winkler worked as an intelligence analyst for the C.I.A., also as a historian for the Air Force, and as an archivist for the Smithsonian Institute. Dr. Winkler has published 40 books and articles dealing mainly with medieval and U.S. military history, including 2 articles which won him prizes in the Utah Historical Quarterly. 2 of his articles deal with Henry Wirz and the tragedy of Andersonville and the Wirz trial. Dr. Winkler is completely convinced that Henry Wirz was innocent of the charges brought against him at his mockery of a trial, and the Swiss Guard deserves great praise for his efforts, which saved lives of many captives at Andersonville who would have died without his efforts. Dr. Winkler considers Captain Wirz's greatest achievement was his refusal of the offer to spare his own life from execution if he would implicate Jefferson Davis in some kind of conspiracy to harm federal prisoners of war. Wirz was clearly a martyr to the cause of the Confederacy. Let's welcome Dr. Albert Winkler.
I'd like to bring you greetings from the West. Might want to tell you something you do not probably know about, but Utah was the only territory in the United States to undergo slavery. They had a vote on it. The legislature passed it in 1852, something that I should also remind you of, that the United States government decided to take out Utah in 1858, a few years before they decided to attack the Confederacy. It is true, to my great chagrin, that I do not have any Civil War ancestors. I have to live with that the rest of my life. I'll tell you one thing, though. I can't help my heritage, but I can choose where my heart is. And my heart is right here. I commend you for your work. I commend you for your service. And I want to tell you one thing else. I've taught many years a constitutional history course, usually 2 classes a semester at universities. And I am completely convinced that the South had every legal right to leave. And I also completely convinced the Union had no right to try to force them to return. The trial of Henry Wirz, a prejudice court. The trial of Henry Wirz started when a special military commission of 9 senior Army officers was chosen in Washington, D.C. Colonel Norton P. Chipman was the prosecuting attorney or judge advocate of the proceedings. Many of the members of the commission had personal grievances against the Confederacy. 8 of them had served in battle during the Civil War. 3 of these men had been wounded in that conflict, and Francis Fessenden had lost his right leg in battle. John White Gary had also lost his son, Edward, in battle to the Confederacy. The men in the military tribunal had vested personal and professional interests in finding Wirz guilty in a spirit of revenge, self-promotion, and to vindicate federal policies. Only 3 of the commission had any legal training, and only one, General Lew Wallace, the famous author of Ben-Hur, had served on a military commission before. Wallace was the president of the commission, and he hated the defendant before the trial began and described Wirz as having an evil demeanor like a depraved animal. He had eyes large and very restless, a peculiar transparency, reminding you of a cat's, excited by the scent of prey. In the manner he is nervous and fully alarmed, avoids your gaze, and withers under the knit brows of the crowd. His complexion is ashen, bloodless, almost blue. Altogether he is well chosen for his awful duty, which was to kill Union prisoners. The U.S. Constitution states, "The trial of all crimes shall be by jury. Such trial shall be held in the state where the said crimes had been committed," meaning that the proceedings had to be by a jury trial and had to take place in Georgia. The Fifth Amendment adds that the trial of capital or infamous crime is illegal unless an impeachment or presentment of a grand jury. No such jury met. The trial of Henry Wirz begins. The specification of the charges were a long list of supposed crimes, stating that Wirz had conspired with Confederate officials to kill Union prisoners by subjecting them to torture, great suffering, by confining in unhealthy and unwholesome quarters, by compelling the use of impure water, and by furnishing insufficient and unwholesome food. As a result, many of them, whose names are unknown, sickened and died by reason thereof, which he, the said Henry Wirz, then and there well knew and intended. The specifications included a number of other claims, including that the guards had followed orders, quote, maliciously and needlessly given by said Wirz, that said prisoner guard did fire upon and kill a large number of said prisoners, whose names are unknown, to wit the number of about 300. This total was severely exaggerated. The Confederate jailers recorded name, unit, and cause of death for 12,367 Union soldiers who died at Andersonville, and only 2 were listed as dying after they had been shot by the guard. The indictment included 13 specifications of murder in violation of the laws and customs of war, for which Wirz was personally responsible. These charges were based on questionable and unreliable evidence. Some of the supposed crimes took place when Wirz was away from the prison, and one crime involved a violent assault which the ailing Wirz was physically incapable of administering. Louis Shada and Otis H. Baker served as defense counsel for the accused. The 2 lawyers immediately entered a series of pleas, contending that the trial was on insecure legal grounds and the defendant should go free. The court also had no legal jurisdiction over the defendant because of the surrender of Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston to Union General Sherman, which specified that all men under Johnston's command, including troops in Georgia, will be permitted to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by the United States authorities. Technically, a pardon had been granted to all these men, including Wirz. Additionally, Wirz is not and never has been in the land or naval forces of the United States, and no U.S. military court had jurisdiction over him. Also, the Civil War was over, so a state of war could not be used as an excuse to place military courts over civilians. As a common citizen, the defendant had the right to a civilian trial by jury, comprised of his peers, rather than by a military tribunal, which could skirt the normal procedures of jurisprudence including the rights of the defendant. The court rejected all these pleas. Unreliable testimony. At the trial of Henry Wirz, the prosecution, headed by Norton P. Chipman, used the vast financial and legal resources of the federal government to prosecute the case. As judge advocate, Chipman had much power over the court proceedings and how evidence could be presented. And he controlled who was summoned as witnesses for both the prosecution and for the defense. This meant that Chipman could refuse to let the defense subpoena important ex-Confederates who could testify on its behalf. Not only could Chipman give the prosecution an unfair advantage in the proceedings, but he could also inhibit the lawyers from making an adequate defense. As Dr. Gaeta Kuting has summarized, the inability to summon witnesses decisively hindered the defendant's performance during the tribunal proceedings. A total of 143 persons gave statements at the trial, 109 for the prosecution, but only 18 for the defense. Approximately 16 others were either called for the prosecution and later recalled for the defense, or the reverse. Clearly, the huge volume of testimony presented against Wirz meant to give the impression that the case against him was overwhelming, as though the trial could be decided by the weight of attestation alone, and while obscuring the question of its accuracy. From the outset, the military tribunal favored the prosecution. When the counsel for the defense, Baker, objected to some aspect of the trial or to the nature of the proceedings, the court overruled him the vast majority of times, while Chipman's objections were almost always sustained. The government paid the traveling, lodging, and food expenses for witnesses, as well as the handsome sum of $3 per day. This was a considerable amount of money during the time period, and could easily persuade many to say something damaging against the former commandant, or to earn their pay. Many of the witnesses for the prosecution were unreliable, including Thomas Alcock. This Union soldier testified that he saw Wirz shoot a man dead with the slightest provocation. But when he was asked to show where that happened on a plat map of the prison, he said, "I am almost blind. I can't even see that piece of paper." And this is a man who saw Wirz shoot a man. He also indicated that he had little idea when the incident took place. This occurred in February, I think February 1865. Oh, wait a minute, maybe June 1864. That's a big difference in dates. Or along there. I can't say for certain what month it was. The Union prisoner Boston Corbett gave vague statements. I very often heard the report of a musket. I knew by what was said that a man was shot, but I didn't see it. Baker immediately criticized such testimony, and he objected to the witness stating anything which he did not see. The witness explained, it was too dark to see, but I heard the whistle of the balls. And know that they fired into the stockade without any provocation whatsoever. How he could know what he did not see was never explained. And his statements were clearly exaggerations or simple fabrications. Baker, the defense counsel, again said, he objected to the witnesses stating anything but what he knew himself. General Wallace, as president of the court, put the defense counsel in his place and set the policy allowing hearsay evidence for the remainder of the trial. The witness may state what he heard among the prisoners at the times the killings took place, what the prisoners said and what the sentinels said, by whose orders the fighting was done, etc. The court wants to hear it all. As the historian William Marvel has explained, the trial record runs heavy with some of the most absurd hearsay any American judge ever permitted to stand. At least some of the witnesses appeared to have been coached or intimidated to slant their testimony. Baker stated that many witnesses who came for the defense had been manipulated or intimidated. The defense counsel wanted to call attention of the court to the fact that many witnesses who have come, subpoenaed for us, have been examined on the part of the government. And sometimes witnesses have complained that improper language has been used to them to draw out something for the prosecution. Baker, defense counsel, added, "Witnesses come here under very peculiar circumstances. Many of them feel it is necessary to say and do all they can do, to leave a favorable impression with the government officers, to show their friendship or good feeling to the government." According to the lawyer, some of the witnesses intended and feared that they might be liable for some kind of retaliation from the federal government, often stating, quote, "Why do you suppose I will leave anything undone to save my own head?" Witnesses for the prosecution included Confederate officers in the prison system. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander W. Persons commanded the 55th Georgia Volunteers, who served as guards at the prison. He outranked Wirz and should have borne some responsibility, maybe more responsibility, for the conditions at Andersonville than did a mere captain. But Persons had clearly been offered a deal for his testimony. He would not face prosecution if he accused Wirz. The federal government gave some of the witnesses rewards for giving proper testimony. Felix Stielebaum stated that he had seen Wirz shoot and kill 2 prisoners just for leaving a line of men. A few weeks later, Stielebaum was rewarded for his good work with an appointment to the Department of the Interior. But Stielebaum was a charlatan. He claimed that he was born in France and he was a grandnephew of the Marquis de Lafayette. But his career as an employee for the federal government ended in a few weeks after he was recognized not as Stielebaum, but as Felix Uslar. He was a German, not a Frenchman, and he had deserted from the Union Army. Benjamin B. Dykes was employed as a railroad agent at Andersonville, and he said that there were sufficient rations for the men in captivity, and there was a good many vegetables raised nearby. But the prisoners were not allowed to purchase anything, even if they had funds to do so. Yet Dykes gave his testimony in fear that the federal government could charge him for crimes committed during the war if he did not cooperate sufficiently. His testimony was acceptable, and he received a full pardon from the War Department. Colonel Chipman did his best to keep the defense counsel from presenting evidence which would besmirch the reputation of any government official. When Baker stated that a petition from the Union captives at Andersonville requesting a prisoner's change had been brought to the President of the United States and to the Secretary of War, they both ignored the request. Chipman immediately objected vehemently. Quote, "The proposition of the counsel is to prove in this unheard of way a fact which can scarcely be believed of a man whose name and fame are so unstained and unimpeachable as that of President Lincoln. This court must not allow slander of that kind against the memory of such a great and good man as President Lincoln." Lincoln could not be criticized in any manner whatsoever, and Lew Wallace soon sustained this objection. The testimony against Wirz tended to be vague. Only a couple of instances was the evidence specific enough to include the name of a victim. Almost in every case, the name of the victim was unknown. However, George W. Gray said he saw Wirz shoot a man named William Stewart, a private belonging to the 9th Minnesota Infantry, with the least of provocation. But there was no entry in any records at the prison that Stewart ever existed. Furthermore, when prisoner examined Wirz's revolvers and found that neither of them was operable, they could not be fired. A weakened defense. Wirz's defense counsel wanted to call high Confederate officers and politicians, including General Lee, James Sid, and Secretary of War, Stephen Mallory, Secretary of the Navy, Samuel Moore, Surgeon General, Robert Ould, Commissioner of Prisoner Exchange, and others. The attorney wanted these men to verify the fact that the South had too few resources in food and transportation to feed their people properly, and they could not supply the prisoners of war, meaning that Wirz was not responsible for the meager rations at Andersonville. But the court ruled that these Confederate officials were guilty of treason. Of course, they hadn't been tried. Were guilty of treason, and as criminals, they could not testify. Baker, seeing that he was unable to call the desired witnesses, closed the case for the defense. In his statement, Wirz gave the court a solemn affirmation of innocence. The defendant stated that he never personally killed anyone, and he objected strenuously that there was a conspiracy to kill Union prisoners. I am not conscious of there being one particle of testimony in the entire record going to establish the charge or giving even a faint color to the probability of its existence. He added, there's not a shadow of testimony by which it can be proven that the deaths at Andersonville, can be proven that it was the fruit of a conspiracy. His statement in his own defense was well-reasoned, passionate, logical, and it fell on deaf ears. Colonel Chipman presented his summation to the prosecution over 2 days. He made nebulous statements such as, quote, many things are proper in the time of peace, which in time of war become high crimes. This included such questionable infractions as a timid loyalty, or yielding to doubtful and hasty clamor, as though it was necessary to find the defendant guilty as a matter of patriotism. Clearly in an appeal to play on the fears of a renewed uprising, Chipman argued, the war is not over. True, the muskets of treason have been stacked. The armies of the rebellion are dissolved, but by far the largest portion of Southerners are sullen, silent, vengeful, and ready to seize every opportunity to divide the loyal sentiment of the country, and with a spirit unbroken, defiant, would this day raise the standard of rebellion if they dared to hope for success. Fear is a powerful motivator, and Chipman stated that constant vigilance was required, so Wirz had to be found guilty as a matter of national defense. Incredibly, Colonel Chipman spread his summation to accuse the leaders of the Confederacy, even though they were not on trial, but he said they were guilty of a large number of crimes, from the treatment of captives to the use of guerrilla warfare, to sabotage, to the spread of infections, to the execution of prisoners of war, to the use of landmines against soldiers, and many other highly questionable assertions. The logic of these accusations was that since the Confederate leaders were responsible for the war, then they were directly responsible for everything that happened in it, either by Union or Confederate soldiers. Also, the rebel leaders knew of conditions at Andersonville, and since they did not solve these problems, then they had to be responsible for them. The verdict. Before stating their findings on Wirz, the commission stated the guilt of many Confederate officials, meaning that finding these men culpable was the first and perhaps the most important aspect of the trial. That Henry Wirz did combine, confederate, and conspire with them, the said Jefferson Davis, James A. Seddon, Howell Cobb, John H. Winder, Richard B. Winder, Isaiah H. White, W. S. Winder, W. Shelby Reed, R. R. Stevens, S. P. Moore Kerr, James Duncan, Wesley W. Burr, Benjamin Harrison, and many other names unknown. It's a very broad net. He's almost excluding nobody at all. And they maliciously, traitorously, and in violation of the laws of war, to impair and injure the health and destroy the lives, the number of 45,000 soldiers in the military service of the United States of America held as prisoners at Andersonville. The eminent Civil War historian, James McPherson, has argued, few, if any historians would now contend that the Confederacy deliberately mistreated prisoners. Rather, they would concur with contemporary opinions held by Northerners as well as Southerners that a deficiency of resources and deterioration of the Southern economy were mainly responsible for the suffering of Union prisoners. The South could not feed their own soldiers or civilians. How could they possibly feed enemy prisoners? The tribunal then found Wirz guilty of 10 of the 13 specifications against him, and the court do herefore sentence him, the said Wirz, to be hanged by the neck till he be dead, at such time and place as the President of the United States may direct. Recent researchers and historians have been almost unanimous in condemning the proceedings and the verdict. Robert Scott Davis has affirmed his trial, Wirz's trial, failed to produce any credible account of his acting with personal cruelty or evidence of his role in any kind of conspiracy. The trial was only a formality for a defendant facing the gallows at the hands of a prejudiced court. William Marvel stated that Wirz was a dead man from the start. Overdell Fuchs wrote that the trial was a legal lynching of Wirz. Charles W. Sanders claimed that the entire proceedings was a sham, and a poorly executed sham at that. The lawyer, Glenn W. LaForce, agreed that the trial of Henry Wirz was worse than a mistake, worse even than a miscarriage of justice. The trial of Wirz was a national disgrace. Vengeance, not justice, had been served. A martyr for the South. No doubt Wirz considered himself to be innocent of all crimes, and he convinced his closest associates of the fact. There were two persons whom Wirz would not dare mislead: his defense counsel, who needed all relevant facts to prepare for a proper defense, and the Catholic priest to whom he confessed his sins. As Wirz stated at the beginning of his trial, "My conscience is clear. I never dealt cruelly with the prisoner under my charge. If they suffer from want of shelter, food, clothing, and necessities, I could not help it, having no control over those things." Wirz's attorney, Louis Shada, maintained his entire life that the guard was innocent, quote, protesting up to the last moment his innocence of these monstrous crimes with which he was charged. He received my word that, having failed to save him from the felon's doom, I would, as long as I lived, do everything in my power to clear his memory. I did that more readily, as I was then already perfectly convinced that he suffered wrongfully. The night before the execution, I skipped one. The Catholic priest, Father F.E. Boyle, was Wirz's confessor, and he heard the condemned man's confessions for weeks before his execution. Wirz would never dare lie to his priest, because that would place his soul in jeopardy. While church law forbade Father Boyle ever divulging the content of Wirz's admissions, the priest gave a summation of what the condemned man had said, quote, I know that he was indeed innocent of all the cruel charges on which his life was sworn away, and I was edified by the Christian spirit in which he submitted to his persecutors. The night before the execution, government agents came to see Wirz in jail. One of them spoke with Father Boyle first. I know that on the evening before the execution of Major Wirz, a man visited me on the part of the cabinet officer to inform me that Major Wirz would be pardoned if we would implicate Jefferson Davis in the cruelties of Andersonville. These agents came to the captive the same night and offered him a pardon to implicate Jefferson Davis in the crimes of Andersonville. Wirz rejected this cheap bribe with contempt. These men have just offered me my liberty if I will testify against Mr. Davis and incriminate him with the charges against the Andersonville prison. I told them that I could not do this, as I neither knew Mr. Davis personally officially or socially. But if they expected with the offer of my miserable life to purchase me to treason and treachery to the South, they had undervalued me. Henry Wirz was taken to the place of execution. A long list of accusations were read to him as he stood on the scaffold. When asked if he had any last words, Wirz replied, "No, sir. Only that I am innocent and will die like a man, my hopes being to the future. I go before my God, my almighty God, and he will judge between you and me." The soldiers mocked him as he died. The men detained to watch the execution were chanting, "Hang him, Andersonville. Remember Andersonville." Wirz fell and the trapdoor was released, but the rope failed to break his neck, and he writhed in agony for 20 minutes before he strangled to death. At least federal revenge ended at that point. The sacrifice of Henry Wirz was not just for the honor of the Confederacy and refusing to implicate innocent people such as Jefferson Davis in a plot, but his sacrifice also satiated the Union desire for more blood, and there were no more executions. Thank you very much.